In 2024, no one can deny that podcasts are one of the most powerful tools to become a thought leader in the industry, to become known, and to turn regular people into experts. And even here in the podcast space, I've been able to get people who I only thought were dream guests into actual clients, and taking my expertise of well over 10 years of experience into actionable advice that people all around the world use every single day. Now, the reality is that even though podcasts can be incredible, powerful tools, brands and agencies have trouble tracking the return on investment. In fact, through the State of Podcast Agencies 2024, trackable return on investment is the biggest constraints for brands in podcasting. It was about 33%. So if you have a show and you've been struggling to track its performance, and if it even makes sense in the business that you have, this is the episode for you. I'm Annick Xavier. I'm the founder of the podcast space, and in this agency, we help business owners who are impact-driven understand how to leverage their show to grow their influence and their business through effective podcast marketing. And so in this episode, we're going to be talking about the three most important metrics that business owners should track that are related to podcasting, and they are likely not doing it. And no, I'm not talking about podcast downloads, so stick until the end to find out all the things you need to track. If you have been podcasting for at least 6 months and you're looking around in your business and you're trying to maximize the efforts that you've been doing and understanding how could you use this show in a better way, well, this episode honestly is going to bring you a lot of awareness and a lot of clarity, because when you're looking at your podcast dashboard, it can feel confusing. It can feel like, what is the data that matters? What is the data that doesn't really matter? And so here at the podcast space, that is exactly what I do with business owners. So we dive into the numbers, we break those numbers into actionable advice, into practical strategy that will help them grow the show and help them understand what is it that isn't working and why. And I normally tell podcasters, you need, just like when you get in the car and you are going somewhere, you need to know the final destination, i.e. the goal of your podcast. Because when you don't, then basically just going for a wander in the car and you have no idea what you're going to do next. And there are so many different ways to grow a podcast and so many different metrics to track that it's important to always place the metrics that I'm going to be talking about against that one goal for the show. So if you haven't listened to episode 4 of season 1 of the podcast space, I break down the 7 different ways you can use your podcast. And so that is really, really thorough. I'll include the link in the show notes as well. And I want you to think about when we're looking at trackable metrics to grow our business. We have about 3 that are very important. And the first 2 ones are going to be in our podcast dashboard and YouTube as well. If you have your podcast on YouTube, like for instance, the podcast space is both available on audio and in video. So if you actually have not listened to the video one or watched the video one, I guess, you can do so on YouTube. It's the same name. Now, when we're looking at all of these data, the first thing that we're going to look at in our podcast dashboard is actually the overall trend. And so when you're looking at your podcast dashboard in the last 90 days, is the trend to grow, to shrink? Is it stable? What is it? Because when we're looking at the data from the week to week, we can feel really frustrated because, again, imagine you have an awesome interview, and this has happened many times. Even for me, I've released episodes that I was like, this is going to be the jam. This is going to be the best episode ever. I know people need to listen to this. And then something happened in the news cycle. And this is something that I know because, again, I worked in the content distribution for a PR firm. So even though I was doing podcasting, I got to learn a lot about how PR works. And you're really, really, in a way, hostage to what is happening in the news. Because think about it, when there's something really important going on, it floods not only every single element of social media, of the news channel, but also a lot of people who have maybe daily shows, and that's one of the reasons why people consume podcasts. When they're tuning in, they're probably going to be consuming a longer show if it's like something in development, or maybe even if the host released multiple episodes to cover a specific event. So looking on the week to week, it's not necessarily accurate because it's too soon and can be affected by too many variables. So when we're looking at 90 days, so about 3 months, we can really see trends. And that's exactly what I do with clients. And so we're looking at how it's growing, why isn't it growing, and we take a holistic approach to what's going on, which is connected to one of the things that I'm going to be talking about later in the episode. But when we're looking at the overall growth, we really have to ask ourselves, what have we been doing this quarter differently? And that's when we need to understand why our listeners are coming to us. Who is this person that is tuning in every week on or every episode? It's super important to understand the fluctuations and seasons of our industry. So are there busy seasons? Are there seasons that are slow? Is this conference season? What is it that will influence listener habits? So looking at the overall growth or shrinkage or stabilizing of the podcast numbers, we are able to understand a bit more if what we're doing is working or not working. And then when we're looking at our dashboard, we're still going to be looking as well on the episode level. That's number 2. So we're going to be looking at the episode consumption. And the reason why this is really important is that as a business owner, you are busy. Your time is valuable and you have business goals to get to, right? Like you set up goals in the beginning of the year or you set up goals for the business and you are on track or not on track to reach those. And the podcast should be your tool to get to those, right? So it is important to understand that if you are spending, and this happened to a client of mine, he was spending an average of like an hour per episode. And so when we were looking at the episode consumption, when we were looking at how much people actually were listening in, people were only listening in about 20 minutes. And there's a lot of factors that can influence on this. It can be that there's a loud sound effect, that you have like maybe like an ad break that puts listeners off and that they stop listening. It may be down to the script. Maybe you have either a pre-recorded segment or a different specific segment that doesn't land well with listeners. And so if you're creating an episode that is 1 hour long, but people are not listening to that hour, you're wasting your time by recording a podcast episode that is that long. And so when we're looking at the time that you're using, I mean, you can record 2 separate podcast episodes in 1 hour. You can record, heck, even 3. Sometimes I can record 4 when I'm like on it and it's an audio only podcast. And so when we're looking at episode consumption, the average that you want to aim at is about 60 plus. A really good consumption rate will be around the 80 plus, right? And you can access this either in your podcast dashboard or in Apple Podcasts or even on YouTube and on Spotify for podcasters as well. And again, if you are a business owner who's pitching your products and services at the very end of the episode, they're not even getting there. So just make sure that when you're looking at the episode consumption, if you're creating episodes that are, 2 hours long and people only listen to the first hour, you're taking a lot of time that is unnecessary. But also, if you have a team and they're editing podcasts, that also is slowing them down. It may incur into costs because it's more expensive. Most podcast agencies, I ran my own before, so I know how we do it, right? If it's until like the 50-minute mark, you pay one thing, and then if you go over, you're going to be paying more. And so really is about the quality, not the quantity here. So really looking into that data and again, making those changes is not only going to help you retain listeners, but also when people find your podcast, they're more likely to stay around because they know that the quality of the content is making their time worthwhile, right? So there's the people who will be driving for 1 hour and that they need a longer podcast. But again, you only know when you're looking at data and you're having conversations with your listeners doing social listening. Now let's move into number 3. Number 3 really is something that I feel most business owners are not doing. They're trying to do all the things and they're not looking and tracking what is actually getting traction in growing the podcast and bringing people in. And that is the top 3 channels that are bringing the most traffic for your podcast. And now these are some examples. Is it social media? Is it SEO, so search engine optimization? Like, are people coming from Google? Is it because of podcast guesting? Have you been very effective at podcast guesting? Is it public speaking? Is it paid marketing? And as a business owner, as someone who may have a side hustle who's trying to make the podcast their, full-time activity or really growing this into a business, the reality is if you're doing social media, SEO, podcast guesting, speaking, paid marketing, or even a newsletter, you want to be mindful of where you're spending your time, because it's not uncommon, and I would say 90% of times that I work with a client, they will come to me and say, we're doing all these things, we're really spreading ourselves thin, and we feel like we're not mastering any of these strategies. Every single one of them can grow your podcast, but when you're trying to do the bare minimum on every single one, it's going to impact how listeners convert into podcast listeners. And yes, over 50%, about 54% of podcast listeners will follow a host on social media if it's their favorite host. So yes, every single one. Again, SEO is super effective at getting you listeners. Newsletters are super effective as well. But what is it that is working, that is bringing the most people? Work smarter, not harder. That's always what I tell clients. Let's already leverage what is working. So when we are thinking about what to do next, we're doing a few things, but we're doing them really well. And again, I'm not saying just focus on one. Remember, I said 3, because what happens is if you're doing only social media, and let's say if you follow me on social media, I'm on Instagram at the podcast space. That's when I share a lot of tips and kind of behind the scenes of what's going on here at the podcast space and podcast advice and podcast data. I create and nurture a relationship with the listeners of the show, with people who actually are not listeners yet, but they have been following me for maybe a month or 2, and they haven't made the jump to listen to the podcast. And it's important to understand that social media will not exponentially grow your podcast, but it will give you brand awareness for new listeners and new communities. And so SEO will do the same. It's a long game. Podcast guesting is super effective because, again, they're listening to you on someone else's podcast. They're more likely to convert into a podcast listener than, for instance, like a social media follower, right? Public speaking is so easy. I know for a fact that when I go to Podcast Movement, to the London show, the podcast show in London, all of those events, when I meet people, I always see growth in my accounts. I always see on the dashboard a growth that is around, 30, it can be sometimes 40% growth from one week to the next. And I know because I know that events tend to be really, really helpful. In fact, I actually have one episode that I will include in the show notes about how events actually can grow your podcast. Now, paid marketing is super effective as well if you do have a budget for it. So every single one of these elements, as I just said, they're super powerful. And then they need to be mapped out against that one goal that you set up for your podcast. Because if you want immediate growth, well, maybe SEO is not going to do that for you. You'll only see maybe the results within 6 months to a year. And so when we're looking at how to market our podcast, how to grow our business through the show, we really need to look at tracking these 3 metrics. The first thing on our dashboard is, have we grown in the past 90 days, the past 3 months? What has been the trend there? And then the second thing is the episode level, looking into the episode consumption. How much have people been listening in and adjusting our content, our frequency to what listeners are telling us that they are doing, right? And then the last but not least, as I just said, the 3 top channels that are bringing the most traffic. Instead of spreading ourselves thin, we're laser focused in what is working. Now, if you're listening to this and like, that is well and good, Anna. Like, that's a lot though. That's exactly why you should be working with a podcast expert, right? So we look at already what is working in your dashboard, what you may have been missing, because there's always that connection, right? We can't tell the forest for the trees when we're doing our own work. And it's sometimes easy to forget all the different things that we're doing. And so identifying those key elements that are helping already, either growing our show or that we see that there's some promising elements there, or what is sustainable for long-term growth. Those 3, that beautiful trifecta, is what's going to get you to those results to grow your show, right? So if you feel like you need support, we're nearing the end of the year, so it's the perfect timing to revise what you've been doing, to audit what you're doing, so you start 2025 winning. And so I invite you to visit thepodcastspace.com to book your free call to discover what is the thing that is keeping you stuck and how you can grow the podcast. I've been Anna Xavier. As always, I invite you to share these podcasts with a friend. Word of mouth is one of the most powerful ways to get the show out there. And if you can rate and review the podcast, that's even better. And as always, keep creating imperfect content that moves you forward. I'll see you in the next episode.